Polarization is negatively affecting workplace dynamics because employees are increasingly bringing their personal and their political beliefs into the office, and they really expect their companies to take stances on these very divisive social and political issues.
You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series, and in today's conversation, we're going to discuss how companies are navigating the hyper-polarization and regulatory shifts that are facing them this year, especially in this massive election year globally. Joining me today is Merel Spierings, the senior researcher at the ESG Center of the Conference Board. Merel, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so Merel, you just issued this report from the ESG Center that's entitled "The Navigating an Election Year at the Peak of Polarization," and it's a great report. It focuses mostly on the U.S., but just give us a little overview of the report.
Yeah, sure. So the report presents key findings from research by the Conference Board. So these insights stem from a roundtable that we held in March with 193 government relations, legal governance, public affairs, sustainability, and communications executives, as well as an accompanying survey of 96 executives. And so the overall takeaway is that the 2024 US elections present companies with real, very complex and multi-layered challenges. We have the overall political environment that is very challenging because of hyper-polarization. Then we have the regulatory environment where companies are dealing with policy gridlock and increasing regulations. And then we have the micro environment for corporate political activity, and companies really experience a lot of challenges there because of increased scrutiny. So every environment basically has its own challenges, but they are interconnected.
Yeah, and the report says that over 60% of the respondents thought that today's political environment was more challenging than even the last election.
Correct.
And there are a lot of reasons for this, of course, but one of the key considerations is the workforce. Companies and corporate leaders have to think about all their constituents, customers, employees, owners, but particularly in the workforce, it's a concern this year, isn't it?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So polarization is negatively affecting workplace dynamics because employees are people, right? And they are also consumers, but employees are increasingly bringing their personal and their political beliefs into the office, and they really expect their companies to take stances on these very divisive social and political issues, and they are questioning the legitimacy of opposing viewpoints and decisions. And so it doesn't come as a surprise that 48% of survey respondents say that increased employee demands on social and political matters is making the current political environment more challenging. So that's really a problem. So how companies can deal with this is in addition to address issues that are really core to their business, we recommend them to focus on what we call crossover issues. And those are issues that resonate with employees across the political aisle. So, for example, we have found that issues such as economic fairness, the conservation of natural resources, and issues like hunger transcend party lines and appeal to employees and other stakeholders across the spectrum. So if companies focus on those kind of issues and they communicate well, like what their role is and what their process is for dealing with these issues, they can really foster unity across political and social divides.
Yeah, and there used to be a well-trod path on this, that you never brought politics, religion, or social issues into the workplace, but more and more people are expecting some level of dialogue on this. And we've spent a lot of time talking about and giving business leaders advice on how to deal with this. And basically, you have to bifurcate what you say externally versus internally because of the different constituencies. But you really have to be careful. It's not necessary that corporations business leaders comment on everything, realizing that half your customers, half your employees, half your owners may feel one way and half may feel the other way, in this very divisive kind of environment. So you do have to be careful, because you want to be inclusive of everyone, not divide everybody, right?
Exactly. And companies should really educate their employees and other internal and external stakeholders about how it approaches these issues. And they have to set realistic expectations that the company won't take a stand on every topic, even if they disappoint, some stakeholders with that.
Yeah. Now, you've also talked about how close elections can be, even more problematic. And, again, these aren't issues that, I don't know, 10 years ago that companies and longer that companies ever had to deal with. But, you've got national elections now that are being decided by, several hundred votes. And, when that happens, there's just this feeling of concern and tension within the workforce, within your customers, that brings it to the surface. And how are you recommending that companies deal with that?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. So extremely close elections intensify volatility and polarization because of the heightened political stakes, as well as the increased potential, or at least the potential of allegations of fraud, policy uncertainty, and challenges to governance. And so, unfortunately, companies' ability to improve the political environment is quite limited because it extends beyond their direct sphere of influence. But many still play a role, and they do so by empowering and focusing on their own workforce through actions that are considered nonpartisan and neutral. And some of these actions include encouraging civic engagement, and civic engagement is, participation in the democratic process. And so, the more people engage in the democratic process, the more powerful our democracy is. And so, civic engagement also mitigates feelings of helplessness in the face of, polarization and uncertainty. And a strong democracy in turn increases, or at least translates into a strong market economy. So it's in businesses' own interest to really encourage this civic engagement, and they do so by implementing get out to vote programs. And those programs, they direct employees to nonpartisan election information, and they really empower them to vote. For example, by providing time off to vote, or encouraging them to serve as poll workers.
So your point is that companies can help empower their employees to engage in the process, and by that engagement, at least they can feel like they're taking action that is proactive, and hence relieve some of this tension.
Exactly, exactly. And so business is very well positioned also to be a trusted source of information. And that's because, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, business is seen as the most trustworthy institution ahead of non-governmental organizations, government, and the media. So companies are really well positioned to educate employees on even the fundamentals of the democratic process, and the importance of democracy, and the role it plays in everyday life. And so they can, for example, share information on local voting processes and registration deadlines and options for early and mail in voting with their employees. So, those are a couple of the things that companies can do to empower their employees so that they feel like they can contribute to the democratic process and feel like they can trust the democratic process.
This comment about the trust barometer is really important. And when you look at the organizations, or the types of folks that fall low on the trust barometer, they tend to be the people who are polarized. In other words, the people who take extreme partisan positions, because they're offending so many who don't agree with those positions. And so, I think as business leaders, we have to think about how do we maintain this higher level of trust. And I don't know if you agree, but I really do think it comes back to maintaining, a nonpartisan
Hmm.
stance
Hmm.
and a neutral stance on these issues for everybody, and to facilitate engagement, as you said.
Yes, I 100% agree. And
Yeah.
I think it's important though that companies also prepare for potential disruptions around the elections, such as the lack of a peaceful transition of power. And they need, and we saw that with the previous elections, but they need to understand the impact that a challenging transition of power may have on employee morale and address the potential emotional repercussions within the workplace. So, for example, by really fostering a place of community and support.
Yeah, and the peaceful transfer of power has not been really an issue in this country, but clearly there are going to be challenges.
Yep.
There are election irregularities in every election everywhere. Usually they're very small, and they're not material. But it comes back to what you said earlier on these close elections. When it comes down to a few hundred votes and everybody's trying to scramble to count everything, then these little irregularities become big problems, or in people's minds, and hence they're blown out of proportion. When there are huge numbers and it's not as close, then it's all rounding error. So I think you have to go back to your context here, and but it looks like the election this year could be very close again if the polls are accurate. And so your point is that people have to prepare. Business leaders need to prepare for and that kind of environment. Yeah.
Exactly. Hmm.
Yeah. Now, we also talked about a changing legal and regulatory environment. Talk about some of the survey results there.
Yes, absolutely. So we just talked about the challenging political environment, but the legal and regulatory environment is considered even more challenging. So 65 of survey respondents describe it as challenging or extremely challenging, and a majority, 55%, find it more challenging than in 2020. And so the main reason for this is increasing regulations at all levels. So that's the federal level, and then the state and local levels. And the problem here is that not only increasing regulations, so that's also, compliance with those regulations, but these regulations can really differ significantly between states and then between the state and federal level. And that just creates a compliance nightmare for companies. And I have an example. California has implemented privacy legislation that stands out significantly from laws in other parts of the US. And so there's concern over whether other states will adopt similar legislation or possibly diluted version, because California has a tendency to take a little bit more strong positions. And other states are moving in the opposite direction to sort of assert their autonomy. So, and then of course you have the federal government potentially coming with its own legislation. So that's a complicated factor. And another complicated factor is that federal regulations often move much more slowly through the legislative process, while states can implement new rules much faster. And that rapid pace forces companies to be constantly vigilant.
Yeah, and there's this. It's very tough to be a business leader when you've got 50 different regulatory schemes by state, and then of course it's multiplied when you get to the local level.
Hmm.
Business leaders just want certainty. They want to know what the rules are, so, and more than anything, so that they can plan and figure out where to make investments and that sort of thing. It's the shifting sands that make it so complex, isn't it?
Exactly, exactly. And so, what companies should or can do, one, they should devote enough, internal and external resources to to monitor the current and the upcoming laws and regulations, and act on them. And then, of course, they should also have effective compliance programs so that they can adhere to these rules. But the government affairs teams play also a crucial role in the regulatory environment, because these teams obviously lobby for regulations that are favorable to their industry, and often they work to create consistency between state regulations. So, for example, they sometimes propose sort of like model legislation to state legislatures as they seek to create a single consistent standard across multiple states, which obviously would make compliance much easier for them.
We're talking with Merel Spierings about the state of the regulatory and political environment today. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Merel Spierings, Senior Researcher in the ESG Center of the Conference Board. So, Merel, I want to go back to the subject we were talking about before the break on this regulatory environment, because I think that, again, we were talking about companies needing consistency and so forth. So the question is how to productively engage in this. And, part of that is through the lobbying process. Lobbying has a kind of a terrible negative name, but really it's more of an education process because, legislators don't always understand the uniqueness of every industry and so forth. But there needs to be engagement, I think is the point. Don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's what we are seeing much more now is that government relations team are moving uh, beyond their more traditional roles of just like advocacy, but they are really trying to engage with internal and external stakeholders to educate them and to help them understand what the implications are. What the implications of the company's lobbying or corporate political activities are, including how they support the company's business and its societal purpose. And so they are cultivating relationships at all levels within the company, but also, with external stakeholders, legislators, etc., to sort of like humanize their corporate political activity.
Yeah, I think the companies that are having the best success are those that actually address all constituencies on this issue.
Correct.
It used to be that you'd have your government affairs group go to Washington and lobby. Okay, well, lobby it's just such a negative thing, and it's tied to all sorts of bad images. But that's in essence not the majority of what goes on. There needs to be this dialogue, and so therefore, companies also need to explain to their employees. They need to explain to business groups around them and local groups, and say, here are the ramifications. Here are the unintended consequences of these things, and so forth. Because I think if you go back up to what's the objective of the rule or regulation that's being passed, you probably find fair consensus on, here's what we want to accomplish. It's in the how and and all the unintended stuff. So that broad level of engagement that you've advised, I think, is so critical.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. And it's, these teams or the companies should really explain how legislation affects not just the firm, but, all the stakeholders. Because, as you well know, consumers or customers and employees are the policymakers' constituents. So it doesn't apply just to companies, but to, their stakeholders as well.
Now, you've talked about the importance of scenario planning in order to accommodate this environment. Talk about why that's important and how to do it.
So the 2024 election outcomes may trigger policy shifts, obviously, at the federal, state, and local levels, and that can really affect companies. So companies use scenario planning to anticipate and prepare for these potential regulatory changes, and that involves forecasting legislative developments and their implications on investment decisions, resource allocation, and even supply chain strategies. And I can give you an example. So, companies, especially in the industry, need to consider the likelihood of legislative support for clean energy initiatives. And so, they need to weigh potential scenarios, including changes in tariffs on solar panels and regulations on energy production, to inform their capital investments and sourcing strategies. And I do want to stress one thing. So, regulatory changes may not be immediately enacted post election. It may take a while. So, companies need to really engage in long term planning and consider the interplay between federal and state governments. And that really requires proactive forward thinking beyond, beyond the election outcomes.
Yeah, and regardless of which party is in power in Congress or in charge in the White House, it doesn't mean consistency. So even if even if the current administration is reelected, doesn't mean that the regulatory environment or the policy environment will remain static. So this notion of scenario
Hmm.
planning is required regardless.
Regardless.
Yeah. And so you've got to, so people need to think through the sort of what if this happens, what
Hmm.
if this happens, what if
Hmm.
this happens, and because it could change your cost structure, it could change the rules of the game, how you go to business, how you do your packaging. I mean, it's just every element could potentially be affected, and companies need to be prepared to change along with that.
Correct. Yeah. And interestingly, regulatory decisions may exhibit bipartisan continuity rather than partisan divisions. And an example is the extension of tariffs. Despite being increased under the Biden administration, they are viewed as a continuation of previous policies rather than a complete departure. So it's not always black and white.
Yeah, no, it's clearly true. Um, what other advice do you have for companies?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the overall political environment. We talked about the legal and regulatory environment, and we talked about lobbying. And lobbying is part, obviously, of the environment for corporate political activities. But it's only one part, it's the advocacy part. Companies also engage in corporate political activity by making contributions and through their pack giving. And pack giving is a means of for employees to engage in the political process.
And PAC stands for the Political Action Committee, and these are formal groups that that within companies that both the company and employees can contribute to, right? And then they're self-governed.
That's right, and they are often conflated with corporate political contributions that involve direct financial contributions from companies' treasury funds, and that
Yeah.
can be allocated to state and local, but not federal candidates or parties. And so it is important for these PACs because PAC giving and corporate political contributions are also under severe scrutiny, especially in a polarized environment. So what companies can do to mitigate some of the risks surrounding PAC giving is making sure that their PACs have a diverse board of directors that represent internal stakeholders across all levels, not just the C-suite. They need to have strong contribution criteria that will allow for transparency about how decisions are made. They need a strong communication plan that details whether and how to communicate about actions that the PAC has taken. And of course, as with lobbying, they need to have ongoing education and communications, not just to the members, so the employees that are contributing to the PAC, but basically to all internal and external stakeholders to ensure there's no confusion, between the different types of corporate political activity.
Yeah, and it's ironic since Citizens United, which was a court case, the view was that political giving would increase by corporations, and in fact, it's gone the other way. Most companies have eliminated direct political contributions, instead using PACs, political action committees, which then are governed, as you said, by a broader group of people. But it goes back to your point that companies can encourage broader participation, and this is a positive way that employees can contribute to the process and engage in the process.
Exactly. And these PACs are heavily regulated, so it's a very transparent way for employees to participate in the political process.
So, just wrapping up, this report basically says that companies need to be really sensitive in this period of time, but especially this election year, and think through all of their constituencies, customers, employees, owners, community, make sure they're balanced, make sure they're communicating all of this and engaging in a nonpartisan fashion to help ease some of the tensions that could occur should there be a close election, but also to encourage engagement, which is really part and parcel to our democratic process. Did I get it right?
You got it right, Steve.
Yeah, so a great report. And so people can find this report at tcb.org and just look for the ESG Center. And I hope that you find other reports that are useful to you in this time. Merel Spierings, thanks for joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Steve.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.